All right, so yeah, all right, so my background. So as I mentioned, this is based on work I did building kind of single sign-on for some large government websites. I've been in security for a number of years. I started back in '98. I started out by doing network security. I actually built an IDS using something called Shadow. Has anybody ever here heard of Shadow? Know what it is? Ah, so we have some people that know it. Yeah, so it was one of the first IDSs, if you could call it that. It's really just TCP dump and some Perl scripts, kind of hacked together a way of looking for things. But over the years, got more into application security, and probably since, so certainly for at least the past 5 years, maybe a little bit longer, I've been really focusing on application security exclusively. And today, I'm actually working at a company down the road. I'm leading their application security practice. We're actually working to build security into our application team, and we're actually putting security specialists that are outside of IRM into our application development teams, and I'll talk more about that at the end. So this is reflective of my personal experience, and the focus from this is kind of the focus that we had at the beginning of the project, was getting them into the system, getting them their user IDs, getting them ready to go to use the application. So, all right, so here's a question for the group. So why would you need an identity and access management system? So, yes?
Because you don't want to share a single user credentials with everybody.
Because you want a single user, or because you don't?
You don't want to have a single user for an application and everybody knows the password for that.
Oh, so you don't want a single one user just for the entire application. You want everybody has to have their own. Okay, so you could do that, but you could do that without an IAM system. You could just build a user login process specific for your application. So I mean, why would you actually buy an IAM product? And there's actually a few different ones out there. Reduce complexity. Maybe also for ease of use. You know, and that was definitely the case that we ran into. In some cases, we were actually building what we called a composite application. So we had, behind the scenes, we had like 3 or 4 different applications, and we wanted to make that a seamless process where you could go from one application, one packaged application to a different packaged application, and do that in a way that people didn't know that was happening. To them, it looked like all one big giant thing, right? So that was one of the main motivators for some of the projects we worked on. So traditionally, so this is actually one of the first challenges we ran into early on was basically kind of people's expectations around identity and access management systems. And when we're talking about IAM systems, we're talking about things like Oracle, the Oracle suite, Oracle Access Manager. We're talking about the products like the IBM product, which used to be called Tivoli, now it's called something else, the Security Suite or something. We're talking about things like CA SiteMinder. There's a newer one out there called ForgeRock. So these are all very large platforms that are designed to kind of solve all your creation, deletion, changes of your user IDs. Traditionally, they're done for one organization, that's hierarchy, where people join the organization, they join the company, they change jobs, their access might need to be reviewed, and then they leave. So it's actually pretty straightforward, and when people think, in many of the teams we were working with, we're used to this approach where they're building out SiteMinder for a single organization with a giant pool of users, and it's like, people get hired and they get fired, and we have to do access reviews. Well, in fact, for the systems that we were building, we actually had 3 different constituencies. With different needs. So we had our government users. These are people who are working for a government agency. They were, the ones that were, helping people get get access to benefits of some kind. We had members of the public who, in our case, were applying for benefits online and trying to get benefits, from an appropriate government program. And then we actually also had NGOs in the mix too, so people who weren't part of government, but they were still providing assistance to these folks to get them benefits. In our case, because we were talking about the Affordable Care Act, it also included, businesses, right? So these are businesses that are trying to get their employees access to health care as well. So the first challenge we ran into, not surprisingly, was actually buying a product, right? So there's a few out there. Here's the reality, right? So these are all big systems, Oracle, CA, and IBM. You're talking about three of the biggest, ginormous software companies out there, and it's one of their biggest ginormous products for each of those companies. So the lesson that we learned here, though, was actually kind of interesting, and it maybe isn't surprising to folks who have been around for a while. You actually have to start with the team. So you kind of have to have the team picked out to support this. They're all platforms. They all need ongoing development. They all need ongoing care and maintenance. So people are hard to find. That's why you need to kind of rely on professional services. So you should have that professional services team picked out in advance. You should basically be happy with your team, and then the product kind of comes with the team. So you kind of pick them out at the same time. So, any questions about that? I mean, is this something others have had to do? Have you actually had to go out and buy one of these big, giant identity access management systems? Anyone? Show of hands? Some? Yeah. So, sir, what's your name?
I'm Brian.
Brian. So, Brian, what was your experience?
So actually, some consultant actually worked in identity access management, so I worked for
Yeah.
Then I do IMG, SailPoint, Oracle, and Simcam and all that. They are very big. They're very expensive. You do need people to, the care of these products, you need ongoing development. Don't think it's something you're going to just like a antivirus, you can plug it in and let it go. It's not going to happen.
So to summarize what Brian said to make these products go, you need someone like Brian, who I guess you're one of the people who's in professional services, kind of. So maybe not. No, Brian's got a lot of his work on his plate, but no, yeah. So exactly, these aren't static products. They really are platforms. They're not like antivirus. They do require a lot of work to really tailor them to your environment, and we definitely went through that. So. All right, okay, so we're actually going to move into kind of the meat of the presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through kind of the user experience of so if you went to a website and you wanted to hey, I've come to this website for the first time, maybe it's Amazon. Hey, who doesn't have an Amazon account already? But hey, maybe you've been living under a rock for the last 20 years. So, you wake up from your coma, you want to get into Amazon, so you go to Amazon and you want to get, the first thing you do is you need to get a user ID so you can get in and so you can, have your account, you can buy your stuff. And that's where we started. So when you sign up for a user ID, what kind of questions do you have, because I think everybody's done this, what kind of questions are you asked? What kind of questions would you want to ask somebody who's registering for your site? Email address. Yeah. Can't do anything without an email address. Interestingly enough, we could ask for email address, but it was not mandatory. We were not allowed to make email address a mandatory thing. We had to support people without email. So, other.
One of the things I had a problem with the government designing websites for this healthcare thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of people out there that don't know how to get online.
Mm-hmm.
Period. Especially older people.
Yep. So a lot of people that don't know how to get online, so yeah, that's part of the challenge of, when you're building a website that's open to everybody, you can't assume necessarily a base level of knowledge. What other things are you going to have to fill out when you're registering your account? Name? IP address? Maybe. Street address. Thank you. I'm not, the ears are not working. Yeah, so the computer knows your IP address, but street address, yeah, absolutely. What about how are you going to get back when you come back to the website? How are you going to get back in? Password, thank you. Sorry, it was an obvious one, but so since I'm an Apple fanboy, here's a pretty typical page for registration, for getting an account. It actually, I think it asks you for, let's see, yes, it asks for some security questions, and it asks for your name and address and your email address, which also becomes your user ID. So that's pretty typical. So, in fact, one of the things we learned about this is that there's actually a few different things that happen when you actually enroll in a website, especially when you're enrolling in a website that may actually already know about you. So, like, if you've had to go on and register on a website for, for your health benefits, for your health plan. Health plans, they join a new job, here's your new health plan, we're going to send you your welcome package. Oh, by the way, please log on to our website and use our website. They're going to ask for some additional information so they can figure out where you are in their systems, so they already have a record for you there. So enrollment, the way I've learned to think about it is actually breaks down into 3 different steps or 3 different parts. These can happen in order. They can happen in different sequences. You can require people to do them all at the same time. But there's 3 pieces to enrollment. First is getting a user ID and a password that goes with it. That's just so hey, we know who you are, and when you come back, we know it's the same person. There's a second piece, which is identity matching. So we have to figure out, okay, so it's John Benninghoff. How do we know who that is in our records? And identity verification, which is kind of proving who you are, who you say you are. And we'll get into each of those in more detail. And one of the things that we noted was because we served 3 different constituencies, we had 3 different ways of getting a user ID. The public, there was too many of them that had to be self-service. That was the only way it was going to work. For the government folks, they kind of expected to get into the system basically using the logins they already had. So I come into work, I log in with my Windows ID and password, and I get in. And I might have to give it again to get in other applications, but that's single sign-on. That's what everybody expects today. That's kind of table stakes. The folks who weren't in either of those, the folks who were in NGOs, right, the non-governmental organizations, for those folks, if they need an ID in the system, well, that was going to either be through some kind of a request process or maybe through federation, right? So where we'd actually just establish a relationship with an outside party and they could manage their IDs, right? So 3 different ways of even just getting a user ID. So related to that, because of that, we ran into a different problem. So we're going to have people that were actually in three different groups and had 3 different kind of roles within the system. So they might be a caseworker who's working for the government, who's helping people get their benefits. They could actually also happen to be applying for benefits as well. And they could be like a volunteer, right? So they could be somebody who's coming in from the outside, helping other people outside of work in their free time, getting signed up for benefits. So, this was kind of one of the early notions that was discussed about how we would handle that, right? So when you come in, you'd have one login ID, and if you had different roles, you'd kind of be presented with a screen like, hey, are you logging in as a caseworker, a benefits applicant, okay, or something else? So I'll just take a poll. How many people think this is a good idea? Maybe some. How many people think this is a bad idea? Maybe some. How many people just don't want to commit to anything? Yeah, okay, so that's most of you. So I guess for the people who think this is a good idea, why do you like this? Forces an explicit choice, okay.
You don't have accidentally privilege of escalation. Login as a system, getting the access that you make it as a caseworker.
Right, so you're not getting the wrong access. Yep, okay, so that's true. So people who think this is a bad idea, what are your, why? Yeah, okay. Other reasons? Right, so instead of having one ID with 3 different roles, have 3 different IDs? Yeah, so we did not do this. Yeah, sorry, what was your comment?
You're asking users who may not know which ID or which explicit role they want to make a choice.
You're asking people who may not know what they want to make a choice. That's true. So I think, so this was actually a fight in some of our work. We actually had to kind of fight this notion. It turns out this is a bad idea, and we'll get into more why this ended up being a bad idea later. To give you a little bit of a preview, just imagine if somebody is a caseworker and then gets terminated from their job as a government worker. How do you handle that? It's a lot more precarious, right? So, all right. So, actually, okay, so here's the lesson. A person could have, so it's been a while, so I apologize. A person could have 3 or more user accounts. I think one of the questions I ask is how many people would like to have one email account for all of their work and all of their personal email all delivered to the same place? Yeah, I don't know, hopefully nobody says yes to that because that'd be a little crazy, right? There's a reason why you keep your personal and your work separate. And for that same notion, I mean, we kind of play different roles within kind of society. And so for that reason, these different roles are really kind of different social roles as well. So what we're talking about here is we're actually kind of, in a way, people might say they want this, but in fact, I think what they really ask for in practice is something more like this. Like, I want my work account to log in to do my work as a government worker. I want a separate account that's associated with me personally, that's not associated with my work, to get my benefits. And the thing is, my benefits could persist for years and years and years. I might be employed by the government only for a year or 2. I might win the lottery. Well, if I win the lottery, I probably won't get benefits. But I might decide to leave and work somewhere else. So. Another thing that was, and we'll see this in the next section about identity matching, another thing we learned is that a user account is not a person. This is really important. So a user account is a way to log into a system, right? It proves that the same person is coming back to the website, but it doesn't represent me, John Benninghoff. Right? That's a separate thing. It really is just a way of logging into the system. When the challenge actually comes in is because normally you get your user account and you establish who you are as a person at the same time. But in fact, we found that we actually separated those out. It was more effective. So, and this is why. So, if you have a system where you're trying to match people up against records in your system of people who already use your service somehow, right? They just don't have their online account yet. You need to figure out, okay, so how do we connect you, the person who's logging into our website, to your stuff, right? Your data, your record. of who you are. For us, this was a problem for the people who are members of the public, people who are government workers or people who are, work for those NGOs. They didn't really have stuff in the system. They were helping to give the benefits. They weren't the recipient of benefits, so didn't really need to get them connected to any kind of an existing record. This is a very hard problem. Even the best identity matching systems don't get up to 100%, and they all require some level of human intervention. So I'm curious to know, so have people actually dealt with this problem? This is not really a security problem. A little bit? So I guess what was your experience? Wasn't worth the effort. Okay, all right. So yeah, and I think this again we had to find a way to match, right? So we had different ways of doing that. Now yes, sorry.
So in the previous one you said user accounts will not be
Mm-hmm.
mapped to the person. So in the here you're doing identity matching. Do you see that those key accounts mapping to one person?
Yeah, so I said that a user account is not a person, and I should clarify, I said a user account is not a person, but in our case, we actually were trying to match a user account to a person, right? So, but that's something that is done separately. So we give them the user account first, and then we could try to connect them to the right person. They may actually represent a household too, right? So they may actually represent several people. So they have the authority to kind of speak for 3 different people. So we might actually match a household, 3 different people to their user ID. We might get that wrong. That's going to happen sometimes. So we need to be able to have a way to actually break that relationship and get that user ID connected to the right person record. So.
Were you able to map like NGO worker
Mm-hmm.
and benefit?
Right. So where do we map the government workers and the NGO workers? We actually didn't map them at all, right? Because they didn't have an identity in the system, right? They didn't have stuff in the system, right? They didn't need that. They just needed to be like a user of the system. They needed just to have the authorization to do what they needed to do. So they didn't have to be identity matched. Yeah.
In that case, to sort of generalize that, the only time it makes sense to take that effort to do identity matching is when there's already existing records or data that somebody wants to claim as theirs.
Yeah, I mean so I don't know if that's the only way, but that's the reason why we did this, right? Because we wanted to match people up, the users up, with the records that they were authorized to see, which was their person record or their household within the system. And in some cases, that was being created for the first time too, right? But we needed to support both. We needed to support things like if somebody lives in your house and they're a minor and they're getting benefits under you, and then you get old enough and maybe you have disabilities, so you're still eligible to continue benefits. We have to allow that separation to happen. We have to allow you now to come back into the system and get access to your benefits online to that existing record. Yes?
It was kind of interesting, the number of cases where this came up kind of grew too. Like some people would sign up, maybe they'd sign up for 4 or 5 accounts. Why? Various reasons. Sometimes they maybe didn't know computers or what have you, or they're already in the state systems and you didn't want to give them access to the records if it wasn't them, but you weren't entirely sure it was them. So there was a lot of interesting scenarios.
So what Sean was saying was the problem grew over time, and it was caused by multiple different things, including people maybe signing up registering for multiple user IDs because maybe they don't understand how computers work, or they forgot their old user ID or something like that. So yeah, so definitely the more we got into it, the more we actually ran into this problem.
So like an example, like an online university, for example, somebody signs up, or they log in, they create an account to see what kind of courses they are, what the cost is. And then, oh, by the way, just for creating an account, you get to take the first module for free. See how you like it. Well, my God, I really like this, but I signed up as John Bell. Now what do I do? So now you got to go back, log back, create a real account with real name, and then you got to get the university to merge those accounts so you can get credit for the first module.
Interesting, interesting.
All kinds of stuff happens.
Either that or you just keep taking courses that don't care what you did. Just keep doing, multiple user IDs and get your whole
degree.
without actually getting credits.
So this is a hopefully fully redacted view of my mortgage. I was extra paranoid, so I blanked out the account number entirely. One of the interesting things about this is that through Citi, they've actually done a pretty good job, I think, with identity matching. So the only way to link mortgage accounts to your login is through like the secret mortgage account number. Maybe not the best way, but I mean, how many people are going to really get your mortgage account number? Probably not many. And you can't, and this is really, I don't know what you can do on here other than just kind of get basically get status on your loan. So probably, maybe not the best security measure, but it works. What's interesting is you can link and unlink mortgages from your account freely. So they make it very clear that matching you to your mortgage is a process that's totally separate from having your login. So I thought that was interesting. So the lesson that we actually took from this was, and this is something we didn't really talk about as much, was the identity access management system shouldn't do the matching. It's actually not really geared for that. It's a data matching problem. There's different tools that you can pick to do this. But it does need to record the results, right? So it needs to know, hey, this user ID links to this person record. Therefore, when they log into the application knows these are this is the person record that we can show, and this is basically this person's stuff. So they do need to know the results of that and track that. Any questions about that? Thoughts on that? Is this making sense? I mean, how many people? So show of hands. Is this a new idea for people? Is this something you haven't thought about before? Yeah, some. Okay, good. So let's actually take it one step further. Let's talk about identity verification. So this is basically saying, okay, so we get somebody to the website, and there's actually a NIST publication that talks about this that'll show up later. You get to the website, you get user ID and password. Now we know when you come back, it's the same person every time. And then you say, okay, I'm claiming to be this person, John Benninghoff. Here's my address. Here's my social security number. Here's my date of birth. Okay, now we're going to match you. Yep, we know exactly which John Benninghoff you're claiming to be. Now we actually have to go through the extra step in some cases, depending on the system, and this was true for us, of actually, hey, we got to verify that this person really is who they're claiming to be, right? We don't want people to get access to data that is not theirs. Getting name, address, and social security number is actually pretty easy to do nowadays on the black market, so you can get those identities. So we wanted to avoid problems around that. In our case, this is actually fairly easy for two of our groups, government users. When you're hired, you got to show your papers. You got to show your passport or your driver's license and your social security card, and so you have to provide those papers. Maybe the government does a background check on you as well. That's pretty common. So their identity is really verified when they're hired. The NGOs would be verified through a process, but the public users were more difficult. Yeah?
You're old enough, you didn't have
Oh, is that right? If you're old enough, you didn't have to?
to. In other words, when I went to service, I didn't have to show them anything.
That's interesting. So that's
It said, this is who I am. Here's my draft, draft card at the time. The only thing I had to show for proof was my draft card.
Well, I suppose if you're getting drafted into the military, they don't care who you are. They just wanted you in the military. But
This is, you gotta understand, this is 60.
that's true. That's true. So it wasn't always that way, I guess. But and I'm not old enough to go that far back. But certainly today that this is true. So all right. So Here's a couple different ways where we might actually verify someone's identity. I didn't know this, but Minnesota actually has like a sample driver's license image. You can go download it, and I'm like, well, this is really cool. So I had to put this in the presentation, being that, of course, I'm from Minnesota. I'm going out to DC. So these were actually a couple of different ways that we allowed that to happen. So people could like show their driver's license to do it, but we didn't want to do that as the first choice. The first choice was to actually do it in an online manner. And what we did was we used the credit services. So we asked them questions. This is something that I think maybe folks have seen elsewhere to basically verify who you say you are. So we'll say, we're going to ask questions from your credit history that theoretically only you would know, like what cars did you own, what addresses did you live at, and none of the above is always an option to try. And so basically you try to trick people into answering these incorrectly. What that came back with was a score which says this is how confident we are this person is who they say they are, and if the score was above a certain threshold, you got in, you were verified, everything was good to go. If you're kind of in that middle zone, you might actually have to call somebody and talk to somebody on the phone. And then the last one was, sorry, we just have no way of verifying. You're going to have to find another way. Yet another reason, yet another reason why we needed to have getting the user ID piece separate from the actual, identity matching and identity verification, because you might have to log into the site and then call somebody on the phone, and maybe you have to log out of the website, or it logs you out automatically. Then you got to come back with your number that says, okay, now you're good to go. You might have to come back, get logged in again, give that number to basically verify your identity. So doing this in two separate processes was really important. And this is the standard 863-2 that talks about kind of identity proofing, identity verification in detail. And it doesn't talk so much about the identity matching, but it does talk about kind of different levels, including kind of like a level, like a first level is just giving somebody a user ID and password so that once that's established, it's the same person returning every time. You don't know who it is, but it should be the same person. And as I mentioned, this was the lesson. You got to verify identity after granting the user ID, but before granting access to any data. It's important. The other thing was you have to provide a manual identity verification process. This is especially important for government because we were dealing with folks who were applying for benefits, a good portion of which may not have any credit history. So they would go to the credit bureaus, they have nothing. If they were a minor, the credit bureaus can't give you anything. So that might be a case too. So we needed a way of doing this manually. I can say for ACA, using a signature on a paper form was considered identity verification. So you would direct people maybe to an alternate method of applying for benefits. So, yes?
So is there always manual intervention? Because if you get the credit scores back or credit information back for someone, what's stopping them from just trying multiple questions over the course of time?
Right. So is there always manual intervention, and what's stopping people from trying multiple times? So there isn't always manual intervention. If you answer the questions correctly, you'll get in. What's to prevent people from trying multiple times? I don't remember what we did to prevent against that, to be honest. I think we did do some things like CAPTCHAs in some places to try to slow people down. I think that in a lot of ways, if somebody's determined to commit fraud and just keep trying, they're probably going to figure out a way to get in, and the best way to deal with that is really just to kind of monitor for that type of activity. So, Sean, anything to add to that? No.
I don't remember either.
Okay. Sean doesn't remember either. So for those of you who joined late, Sean actually worked with me on some of this. So on a lot of this, actually, really. In fact, I could say he did a lot of the work. But So enrollment is kind of like I said, not really necessarily a three-phase approach, but it kind of has to happen in sequence for it to make sense. You could do these simultaneously, you could do them separately, but get the user ID, figure out who that person claims to be, and then basically validate who they are. Now, in some systems, we may not actually care about step 2 or 3. We may only care about 1, or may only care about 1 and 2. But it's a good thing to think about when you're building a system. Keeping these separate actually gives you more flexibility, and it's not an obvious concept, and because people are kind of used to doing things a certain way. In my current job, this actually came up because we're having challenges getting people, enrolled in our website because they forget their magic identity number that gets them connected with identity matching. So that's a problem. Well, if everything's all in one step, it makes it a lot harder. It makes it a lot harder to actually get people on board. If we can get them signed up with a user ID and an email address and some contact information, if they go away, we have a way of reaching them now. We can call them, we can email them, hey, we saw that you tried to apply to get enrolled on our website, but we're having some trouble. Do you want, hey, give us a call and we'll walk you through it. We'll figure out how to find your magic number and get you logged into the system. So, all right, finally, it's been a half an hour and we're finally going to be able to log into the system. So, pretty typical login. This is from Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is great because a lot of their graphics are in the public domain, so you don't have to worry about copyright, which is why you choose them for that, right? So in our case, as I mentioned early on, we want to get people logged in, and we wanted to get them access to multiple systems. So that looks something like this. So we were dealing with systems that to some degree, most of them kind of assumed that you would have a user ID in that application, right? So we had to connect the users from our identity access management system to the databases that were in each of the applications. So we had to make that mapping, and we had to make that mapping make sense. This added some complexity for us because obviously we had to push those IDs out to the systems. Some systems didn't actually require you to provide a user ID to log in. They wouldn't. You could actually just do it directly through federation. But that was the challenge they were facing. This is a challenge both for single sign-on, for when you're signing on to multiple different systems, and it was an even bigger challenge for us when we wanted to kind of create, like I said, a composite application that was kind of building together several different systems and making it look like a single system. So, any questions about that?
So if you've got the notion of like a household, head of household who's doing benefits for somebody who then becomes of age and gets separated, did you find that those application user databases and data stores supported that well, or is that then?
So the question was around if you're the head of the household and you have multiple people under your single account, and one of those people had to leave and get their own user account, did all those applications support that? The answer was sort of. And to that point, I think it's the problem. So to that point, that was a problem not just for the identity access management system. It was also a problem for the underlying systems, right? So that the underlying systems maybe had their own identity matching going on, and they all needed to provide a way to allow folks to kind of leave a household and basically become a separate entity. That problem would exist with or without this kind of single sign-on over it, but that definitely was an issue, and it definitely was discussed.
What approaches help alleviate that issue on commercial off-the-shelf kind of products?
So what helped alleviate that early on? Well, so the COTS products we were dealing with, and COTS is, I can put that in quotes, the COTS products we were dealing with actually they knew about that problem, and they kind of had a solution for that problem kind of built in. Because this is all very new, we're dealing with kind of newer products too, so there's just challenges with products and being new too that we're dealing with that as well, so. Yeah, Sean.
I was going to mention too that one of the issues that comes up in that space is the whole discussion around, do you keep the same identity or do you create a new identity? Sometimes those old systems need to keep that old identity for the records and access to the records, but then under your new life, you maybe need a new identity, but now you've got two identities that are the same person but at different times. So that's something to consider.
So I'm going to try to summarize that as some systems make it even harder for you by requiring your old identity to continue to exist. Then you got to create a new identity, but really it's the same identity, just a newer version of it, and you have to figure out how to manage that complexity too. Yeah, so it can get pretty hairy. So for logging in, yeah, so there's really we really, for implementing single sign-on. There's 3 different ways to do it today. Well, 3 big ways of doing it today. One is kind of traditional, which is you kind of put shims and everything and intercept, with proxies and whatnot, and deal with headers, and it's all kind of proprietary. The other ways are Saml and Oath, and there was a lot of challenge around this, but what we found was, for the systems that we were working with, and this is this is a few years ago, Saml really did work a lot better than traditional. In some cases, we actually thought we were going to do traditional, and we ended up switching to Saml because it was easier and it was going to be better long term. I think that if I was to do it again today, I would require either Saml or OAuth. OAuth is probably at the time was maybe not considered quite as secure. It's gotten better. It's gotten more enterprisey, so it's a little more accessible to enterprises. But for single sign-on, don't use a proprietary traditional method for single sign-on. Use Saml or use OAuth. It's going to be a much better technically. It's a much better engineering choice, and the users won't really see the difference. But from a technology perspective, it's just going to work better. It keeps the applications kind of isolated from a lot of the mess. The traditional ways of single sign-on dig a little bit too far down into the guts of the application. It's harder to do the integration. So I guess I'm curious. So how many people who are doing federation or single sign-on? So how many people are doing mostly Saml today? Okay, got something. Who is doing mostly OAuth? Okay, so more, all right. So anybody doing kind of traditional still, and that's the main way of doing it? So no, okay, well that's good. That's actually good. I'm glad to see that because it's... Kerberos, yeah, that's probably, that's not really in any of these 3 categories. Kerberos is, so the question was what about Kerberos? And yes, for internal systems, for when you're coming in kind of from, yeah, we didn't come across Kerberos. That can be kind of tricky too. But I could see that there's still good reasons to why you'd use that today. So, all right. So what are some of the lessons we learned? This one actually drove me up the wall. Okay, some people are laughing, so I know some people have come across this problem. This one drove me absolutely crazy. So we had one of our applications that used case-sensitive usernames, and they thought that was a great idea. And then we had to migrate to our identity and access management system that did not support, that was case insensitive, like most normal people would expect. That caused all kinds of problems. So, especially for people who are just members of the general public, they're used to typing in without regard to capitalization. We saw people, setting up like multiple different accounts with different capitalization, obviously the same person. They couldn't understand why they typed their email address in and they said your username is not found, so like, all right, I guess I'll register again. Even worse, we had cases where people were like 2 different capitalizations of the same username that was not an email address, clearly not the same person, different names and everything. And we had to sort through that mess and figure out, okay, so how are we going to deal with this? We actually had to assign new usernames to some of our users to fix this. But just a really bad idea. People do not expect this unless they're Unix sysadmins. So do you want to share your experience?
No, not a specific.
No specific experience? Okay, all right, yeah. Well, and again, this is one of those things where, if you've been around, you might actually know, well, that's obvious, but in fact, it wasn't obvious to everybody. Here's another problem that we ran into, right? So each constituency needs a unique user ID namespace. So what happens if, I can register, if our naming convention in the government space is, basically it's J. Benninghoff, first letter of your first name, last name, and that's it. And that's all the names you give. Well, if you let people who are members of the public pick whatever username they want, you might have been a situation where you break your single sign-on because I log in with J. Benninghoff, I try to sign into the app, but somebody has already registered that name. We have this problem to a small degree. And then what do? Oops. So, to get around this, you need to make sure that, that you have reserved somehow a namespace for each group. So, like for the government, maybe, I'm working for the state of, let's pick on Alaska. Let's pick on Hawaii because I would have liked to work in Hawaii. I did not. So you're working for the state of Hawaii. Your username might be jbenninghoff@hawaii.state.us or something like that. I don't remember how we actually named that. But with that, you can say, okay, what you can do then is you can say all Hawaii people are going to have this common suffix, the @Hawaii, .state.us or whatever it is, or state.hawaii.us. And we won't let anybody who's a member of the general public try to register a name with that suffix. We'll just say, sorry, can't pick that name. So this is, again, something that, if you think about it and plan ahead a little, you'll actually come up with this. But it's an easy requirement to miss. You should, another lesson, use a unique identifier specific to your identity access management system to identify the user ID. Do not use social security number because that permanently links that social security number to that user ID. That's probably a bad idea, especially when you end up with some of the situations we talked about. It should be just a UID for the system. So the question was, were we concerned about consistency around having the username set up? So yes, we'd like for there to be consistency, but because of the way it worked, we had to basically let people from the public pick their username, and we couldn't force them to pick an email address. We pretty much just had a free-for-all there. For the other areas, we could enforce more consistency, right? So for the government workers, their usernames were chosen for them using a pattern, right, that had already been established. So they were using their existing usernames. We had to make sure that they were globally unique within that new platform.
Right, what I was saying is enforcing the pattern or having a set pattern to the username, were you concerned about username enumeration?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow what you mean. Mm-hmm. Oh, right. So what about predictable usernames? Were we worried about that? No, not really. I mean, we kind of took the approach, which is usernames are not secret. You know, if, you know, we kind of expected that, you know, it's possible that people might guess usernames. The reality is we did all the things that you would normally do with a system, which was we didn't say invalid username, we'd say invalid username or password. That's something that people forgot, and we sometimes had to remind them, but that did come up. And you know, the other thing is that a lot of these things need to be solved with logging, right? You need to have good instrumentation, and these systems generally did, where we could actually monitor for kind of somebody doing that, like one IP address trying a whole bunch of different usernames. That we should monitor for, that we should alert on when it happens. That's a hard thing to do. Easy to say, hard to do, but you know, that's kind of how we design the system. Yeah?
Around the enumeration, there is like 1 or 2 spots in IAM system where people can enumerate, like say where it's, I forgot my password, put in your email address. And then if you tell them, oh no, that's not a valid email address, now you've given them an enumeration way to do it. But if you use like a CAPTCHA or something, an attempt to slow down automation on something like that, or if you just say, yes, we've sent it, even if it's a valid email or not, then you're dealing back with people who may not be that good with computers. You know, you've just lied to them, and they may not understand why you needed to do that for security reasons. So there's some interesting decisions there.
So to summarize what was said, the part of the challenge was that we needed to clearly communicate what was happening to people who weren't necessarily computer savvy. And there were instances where like, hey, I forgot my username, where people had to go and retrieve that, where people could attack that, but we could slow them down using things like a CAPTCHA, and that was the additional point. Use a CAPTCHA to slow people down. Yes?
You haven't really directly, that's you know, it's not uncommon, but I understand using email addresses as a user ID because they're already globally unique, that's cool.
Mm-hmm.
And easy to remember, hopefully, and easy to remember everything. But I have a real issue with the security aspect of giving away half of the solution to every logon that I have because it's my email address. I mean, it seems, you know, you're removing the two-factor authentication basically because we gave away the first factor and the whole two-factor authentication.
Yeah. So the question was, what you know, how did we have to deal with the fact that if people used email address as their username, that was easy to guess. So that it definitely would be harder if you require people to use something that was not an email address. It was just something unique to that system. Yeah. So yep. So I think. So the comment was, but really the user IDs are to identify, not to authenticate, and I have to agree with that. So, you know, I think that, so we got to be careful when we think about identification. So the social security number is an identification number, but guess what? It's also used as an authenticator. That's why it's actually really valuable. It's not that it's not its identity properties, it's authentication properties. So like in Canada, they have something similar that's called the social insurance number. But there, it's not really used to authenticate who you are. So it kind of doesn't matter. It's not as valuable. It's not valuable like a social security number is. If anybody's here from Canada and I'm getting this all wrong, please let me know. But I think this is right? So that, you know, if it just identifies you, it's not necessarily a problem. It's not necessarily giving something away if it's just like, yep, this is that person. So.
Because we use the social security number for something that was never intended to be.
Yeah, so we're using the social security number as something it was not intended to be used for, which was basically to prove who you are, to be used as an authentication mechanism.
In terms of the two-factor authentication, your identity or your identifier or email address isn't one of the factors that are being checked. So it's not reducing it. You're still using your password.
Yeah, but it's still,
key or what, something
it's still, if the standard is used as email addresses
Yeah, so the challenge is if you have the email address, it's easier to attack accounts. That's certainly true. I would say, yeah, so I would say that that's true, but it's also true even if you're not using email address, unless you're especially paranoid and using a different user ID for every system that you log into, you're probably reusing at least your user ID, and in many cases your password too, but we're not going to talk about that. Use a password manager.
Lost on where knowing someone's user ID reduces a different factor of authentication, because you still have the multiple factors. If I know your user ID, I still need to also know your password and your second form authentication.
But to amplify this
I
point,
agree that it makes it easier.
you're giving away, social engineering opportunity to somebody, because they're going to be using that same email address, a number of different sites, you're going to collaborate, and it really comes, it's not the identity access manager, it's the policy.
The other benefit of using email address is identifier.
Get set up automatic responses when you're not in the office. If you do,
Oh, good point,
yeah.
You just told somebody that's a valid ID address.
I mean, my point is all of these are valid.
One of the best reasons for using an email address as an identifier is it's globally unique.
Yeah.
I stated that at the beginning of my
Yeah,
comment.
yeah, you did. Yep.
I still think though that, okay, let's forget about two-factor. On single factor, if I've got a single factor and I've got list of email addresses, I'm halfway there.
Mhm.
And for instance, with WordPress, popular, they, you read WordPress security, they pretty much tell you, don't use admin as your default username, because that gives the first guy 50% of the deal. And you don't use your email address.
Yep.
You could, but you don't have to, and you can create your own user identity on that platform, and does make it tougher
Yeah.
to crack.
Just one slight point to put in, how many of you have heard of that squirrel protocol that Steve Gibson is creating? The answer is no one.
So the question was, who's heard of Steve Gibson and Squirrel Protocol? I'm sad to say I have.
I wouldn't say sad, but what I'm saying is, it is an interesting solution because it's a different local address space that you're not having to give away information, but I don't want to,
Yeah. So yeah, Steve. Yeah, if you Google Steve Gibson, you'll find it. So I'll just say I generally don't agree with Steve Gibson, and I'll just kind of leave it there.
My point is, let's see where it goes in 5 years. But
Sure.
I think it's an interesting answer to the issue of either having global email addresses that's everywhere that starts building up social information, or you have a system that says two-way proofs on either side of the equation, and you never use that proof. You never have to expose that information. That is a powerful system. So we'll see where that goes.
Yep. So, good discussion. We already talked about this last point, which is Saml and OAuth. I think actually, honestly, so this is written mostly for a government audience. I think that for government audience, they're probably more likely to use Saml, but really, you're probably going to have to support both if you're going to do any kind of single sign-on or federation, and you should really insist on products that support at least one of these if you're buying it, because if not, it's going to just be a pain in the ass. And one of my favorite soapbox talking points is people always underestimate the cost and expense of security administration. And so people who've had to work with or work for or part of a security administration team realize what a challenging, difficult, in some cases miserable job these people have, and really everything we can do to make their jobs easier is a good thing. Yes?
I'm sorry I came in late.
No, that's right.
If you're going to cover this, that'd be fine later, or take it off the topic. But one of the problems I've always seen in these systems is the complexity.
Mm-hmm.
Getting them to interop, expert system shells, et cetera. But in the end, one misconfiguration, no one notices for a while. Is that something you're going to touch on?
Yeah, so the question was about complexity of these systems. I don't really touch on that in the talk, in the prepared slides, but I will say that there is a lot of complexity around setting up Saml and making it work. I think there's a little less complexity around OAuth. It's kind of like voodoo magic, and you got to get the voodoo just right to make it work. I had the same experience with Kerberos years ago. So, I mean, it is a little tricky to set up. It's getting better, but it is definitely something that you need people who've done it before more than once to get it right, because every system is just a little bit different and a little bit quirky.
And part of the challenge is who you're working with, the customer.
Yep.
That's really part of it.
Yeah, in our case, we were kind of integrating systems where we were working directly with most of the vendors, so we could kind of work through those issues. It's like who you're working with matters, yeah. Other questions? Okay. All right, so managing access, we got a little bit into this. Role mapping, I wanted to talk about this. We actually had to do this because we had to set it up. So we actually had to set up kind of high-level roles in the identity access management system, and then map those to roles within each of the applications. We needed to do this in our case really to make sure that there was consistency, because if you travel from one app to the next, your role had to be consistent. But if you're doing single sign-on anywhere, you're really going to have to do some kind of a similar exercise. The big thing, and I'm skipping ahead to the list, the big thing we learned from this was that really the way systems are built today is you centralize the coarse grain authorization, the high-level authorization, and the fine-grain authorization gets managed down in the application itself. Because try as we might, we haven't really ever come up with a good way of doing fine-grained authorization in a centralized manner. There are products out there outside of maybe a handful of organizations like Disney. Disney is actually one that did do some centralized fine-grained authorization as a service to multiple applications. That's uncommon, and a lot of products that you bring in from the outside have their own authorization schemes. So. And that was the first lesson. The other thing, start with fewer roles. So when you're building a new system, especially when you're building a system that's replacing an old system, everybody says, well, we have like 500 roles, and we need all of those roles. They're all equally important. They all got to go in the new system. And you just got to take them from the old system and translate them into the new system. It's all good to go, right? No, it doesn't work that way. So out of curiosity, has anybody actually had to do kind of one of those big replacements where we're taking a big system, replacing it with a new system, and they've had to go through kind of that re-provisioning of all those people on the new system? Okay. So what was your experience? Do you care to share? No? Okay. It was a headache? Yes. So you ended up splitting, so that it was so challenging, you actually ended up splitting it into two different systems. Yeah. And my experience was, even before this is something that I did in kind of my first job. We actually were changing our back office system for a brokerage. We swapping out new system. Pretty much everybody in the company had to get an account on this new system. And I started off and I was in charge of our security team at the time. I went out and started talking to different kind of our key stakeholders, kind of the senior level management folks, and said to them, hey, what do your people need on the new system? And they said, you're the security guy, you tell me. And I said, I have no idea what your people do every day. This is a completely new system. I don't know how it works. I have no idea what to grant access to your people. And for a while there, we were kind of at an impasse because people were frustrated, like, well, didn't we just take the old stuff and translate it to the new system? No, because that's way too much work, and it's actually quicker to have you and your people come to us, learn the new system, learn how the new authorization scheme works, and then you tell us, okay, what's appropriate for different jobs. And that's actually basically what we had to do for these systems as well. And I think the original thinking was like really we're going to have like a dozen roles or something like that. We ended up having like maybe 3 or 4, or I mean, how many was it even that? 4 roles for everybody. What that meant was people probably got more access than they really needed because we only had 4 roles, but there were trade-offs. We had to make some choices. We didn't have unlimited time, so we kind of had to grant people close enough to least privilege, right? It wasn't the best we could do, but it was the best we could do given the time. And we expected those roles to evolve and to grow and add new roles over time, but we really had to start with a very small set. Yeah, question. Mm-hmm.
Does that lesson learned apply to RBAC but not ABAC? I mean, I don't know if we can get into our ABAC argument, but the fine-grained authorization.
Yeah. So the question was, does that first lesson apply to RBAC and ABAC or just RBAC? Well, so for the systems we were dealing with, they essentially just had RBAC. So the lesson applies to RBAC. Does it also apply to ABAC? I don't know. I will say what I actually said recently to some other folks is that I don't know, I have not seen an organization that has done a really good job of implementing ABAC or has really successfully, I would say, implemented ABAC. Now, your experience may be different, and if you are a part of an organization that has successfully implemented ABAC, I would love to talk to you. But I think ABAC is which is attribute-based access control as opposed to role-based access control, is a good idea. I think it's also really powerful and really complex, and so there's some downside to it too. I think that I could go on and on and on about that. I won't. That would probably be a whole separate talk. But bringing it back to this lesson, no, this is really more around RBAC, which is what you're most commonly going to find. Removing access, this is something we touched on, mostly because of costs. Public users are never really disabled, right? They might, so when do people leave the public? Well, they might leave when they die, or they move away, they some other way become ineligible to use the system. But it doesn't happen like in a normal organization. With government users, they leave, you disable their accounts, and you're good to go. Similar process for NGOs. We anticipated this, and we did implement this to some degree even early on. We needed to manage the cost of having all those licenses out there because most of these products charge you by the user ID in some way. And so we basically said, we're going to make some rules around abandoned or inactive accounts, so if people don't come back in X period of time, we're just going to turn the account off. Now, that also meant we had to have a way to reactivate that account, but that was what we kind of had planned. I'm actually going to skip this piece. This is something we didn't implement, but if you're curious, you can ask about it afterwards. So, any last questions? Yes?
Yeah, I apologize for coming in late. Did you discuss the influence of the 911 legislation on uniform identity across different systems?
Did I discuss the influence of the 911 legislation on identity across systems? I did not, and actually I couldn't. I'm not actually even familiar with that, so the answer is no.
Yeah, it seems it's a looming issue for so many
Is
agencies.
that a new issue?
No, it's been around, and I'm not the expert to discuss it. I just know of the issue.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is, basically, there's this issue around 911 and identity. That's not something I came across, and I couldn't tell you why.
What drives that is we've got a username, this kind of person over here. It's identity, but then it comes down to representation of those identity in various
Sure.
systems.
Yeah.
So
Oh, right. So what did I mean when I said, I think the question was kind of, I'll rephrase a little bit. What did I mean when I say use an IAM specific unique identifier? So basically, one of the things you can do with some identity systems is you can have some kind of an ID number associated with an account that's different from a username. Reasons why you might want to do this is if you want to give people the ability to change their username, right? So you could change your username but keep the same identity number. It also helps if you're linking accounts by something other than username. In our case, we actually started out by linking accounts with just the username, but the point of that was really not so much about what's the best way to pick a unique identifier to link these accounts together, but it was really more a lesson about what not to do. Don't use an identifier that's specific to a person. So if you use, like, for example, a social security number or a different kind of identifier, you run into problems. And we had some projects that actually chose kind of a person type identifier to uniquely identify accounts, and we had some problems as a result of it. So if you're linking just user accounts together, just be very deliberate about, we're just linking user accounts together. We're going to have a unique ID number that's only for just linking user accounts together and nothing else. It's a key for just that.
Then is that then the user identifier you use at the application level in each of the applications in a composite?
So is that the user identifier we use at the application level? Potentially. I think it kind of depends on the application. I think in most cases it ended up being the user ID. I think that it was something that we didn't really fully implement. It was more, I think, meant as an extra mechanism to try to prevent the accounts from getting out of sync. So, yes?
In the beginning, you mentioned that in your case, you have option to make emails mandatory.
Yes.
I see some of the sites when you log in, they have option, like, forgot password, most of the places there, but
Mm-hmm.
they also have
Mm-hmm.
user ID,
Mm-hmm.
which is sometimes not understandable, going across a lot of sites. Do you have that kind of option and you add, or if you choose
Yeah.
what would be the one?
Yeah. So the question was, if we didn't require a username, how did we deal with I forgot my user ID? So that actually we did not use an email mechanism for I forgot my user ID. We used secret questions. So basically, when people got their account, we also had them enter their secret questions and secret answers for the secret questions, and then we had a rule around, well, you got to match like 3 of the 5. I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically you got to get so many of the questions right, and then you can get your account recovered. So if people forgot all of their secret questions and answers, and also forgot their user ID, if they forgot their user ID, I'm trying to remember. Actually, no, it was if I forgot my password, we used the secret questions. I apologize. I forgot my user ID. I don't think we actually supported that. I think we basically just assumed that people would create a new account. So yeah, so no, sorry, I apologize. I got that wrong.
So if you forgot user ID, you want to come back and have some already received data, then you will try with the ID match.
So the question was, could we use some existing data that maybe from the identity that was matched to that user to identify the user ID? Potentially, and we talked about that, but we never implemented it. I think that, again, not being able to use email address was something unique to us, because one of the great things about being the government is that all of your rules and policies are actually laws, and they're written for you by your legislature, who may not have any idea how you actually have to do business. So I got a lot of sympathy for the folks who work in the government space, especially in government IT, because no lie, it's like you have to do this. This is the law. Yes.
The Minnesota legislature helped us out with log everything everywhere all the time.
Yes. Yes.
That was a great law.
Yes. Yes.
I want to touch back on the role-based access control for a moment, but only if I understood. When you were helping with this identity management system, there's somebody who has to be mapping that to the back-end resources and other queries. Were you all responsible for that part of the discussion?
So I'm sorry, so which part of the mapping? I'm not sure I follow.
Once you've authenticated a user, they
Yep.
have access to resources.
Yep.
All right, so somewhere there's a mapping that says, given this role, and if the answer is yes, I will have a follow-up question. So I'm just curious, were you guys actively involved in that part of the discussion to say, here's how you're going to integrate?
Right. So I'm going to change the question a little bit. Was I actively involved in figuring out how to map user IDs to the resources that they needed access to? No, I was not. We actually had the experts who, we had the experts in the applications that we were doing single sign-on for actually lead that exercise, right? Because really it's about, and I can tell you what I remember of how that went. They were JAD sessions. Right? So you had joint application development. So you had the people who use the system now, the old system, come in and sit down and learn how the new system worked. And then they started talking about, okay, here's what you get access to on this screen. And they would say, oh, well, these people need access to these things and these other people don't. And so it was kind of a process of both teaching people to the new system and then figuring out, okay, so how do the roles break out from there?
That's hitting on where the question I was going to ask was, if you are an enterprise architect looking at the whole system, one of the places where those conversations become muddled is who really understands the mapping? Because oftentimes it's in people's heads, and you can't do predictive analysis to say, well, we're going to have 4 roles here, we're coming from 15. And then the side question was, if you look at this from an SOA standpoint, 1/4 of all SOAs, again, queries, same is true with roles. They had a reason at one point.
Mm-hmm.
When stale, people don't know how to get rid of it. That becomes part of the confusion of mapping, and then you have escapes through there. Oh, in fact, you must have had some identity access for machine-driven interaction.
So what do we do for machine-to-machine communications?
Authentication and authorization.
Right. So yeah, so the authentication authorization machine-to-machine, that we did essentially separately, right? So we basically just get kind of like service accounts and passwords. So I will say that authorization is a topic of great interest of mine, and I've actually given other talks, including one at OWASP on that topic. I don't have any new material around that, but and actually, I'll be honest, I'm not sure if the PDF is actually on Transvasive right now, but if you go out there and look through some of my older posts, there was something that I worked on with a friend of mine called behavioral security modeling. It really was a weird name for basically us researching about authorization and the difficulty around authorization. And really the biggest challenge was around getting what's in the system user's head, the people who have to run and operate with the system, out of their heads and translated into the security system is actually a really difficult problem.
And that's assuming they really understand it.
It's assuming they really understand it. I think that generally speaking, you can find the right savvy users who understand the system well enough who can really help with that translation. But you have to go find them, and they're the people who are using the system every day usually. So. Oh, you can hire COBOL. Yeah, you can hire COBOL programs to reverse engineer what's in place. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll call it there. We're getting on 7:30, so I won't hold people around. But if you want to stick around after, please feel free.